The woman known to history as Queen Mary II of England, Scotland and Ireland was born on the 30th of April 1662 at St James's Palace in London. Her father was James, Duke of York, the younger brother of King Charles II, the ruler of England, Scotland and Ireland, who had just overseen the restoration of the Stuart monarchy in the three kingdoms of Britain and Ireland in 1660, shortly before Mary was born. Charles was without a legitimate child himself in the 1660s, and so James was his heir, with Mary becoming second in line to the throne herself when she was born. At the time, however, King Charles II had only recently married Catherine of Braganza, and it was assumed that he would soon produce children with his Portuguese wife and secure a direct line of succession. That would ultimately not come to pass, and the repercussions of it would greatly influence the course of Mary's life. Mary's mother was Anne Hyde, the daughter of Edward Hyde, 1st Earl of Clarendon, and for much of the 1660s, the most powerful minister in the government of King Charles II. Anne had been raised as a Protestant, as indeed had James, but both of them had been exposed to Roman Catholicism at length while in exile on the continent, and in particular in France and the Spanish Netherlands in their youth, and they would both convert to Catholicism before long. That they already felt an affinity for the papal religion in the early 1660s was evident in the decision to name Mary after Mary, Queen of Scots, James's great-grandmother, who had been notoriously obstinate in her Roman Catholicism while under house arrest in England under Queen Elizabeth I nearly a century earlier. Mary would grow up in a time when Britain seemed to be returning to some normality after decades of unrest. All the way back in the late 1630s, her grandfather, King Charles I, had ended up in conflict with a huge proportion of his subjects, first in Scotland, where his efforts to impose a conservative form of Protestantism, which many took to be a form of crypto-Roman Catholicism, had led to war with the Scottish nobles and church, led by Presbyterians, adherents of a type of Scottish Calvinism. In responding to this, Charles had come into conflict with the English Parliament, and a rebellion broke out then amongst the Roman Catholics of Ireland. The War of the Three Kingdoms raged through the 1640s, and eventually the English Parliament and military, many members of which were radical Protestants that viewed Charles as a secret Catholic, placed the king on trial and executed him in 1649. Thus, Mary's father and uncle had spent the 1650s in exile on the continent while England briefly became a republic presided over by Oliver Cromwell, an experiment that ended after only 11 years. In 1660, not long after Cromwell's death, the English political community had decided it liked the House of Stuart as rulers of the three kingdoms after all. Charles was invited to return to England, restore the monarchy, and ascend as King Charles II, which he duly did in 1660, 2 years before Mary was born. The Restoration era in the 1660s and 1670s, as she was growing up, was known as a period of liberality, loose sexual mores, and partying at court and in London after the dour puritanical years of the 1650s. But as licentious as the Restoration era might have seemed, the religious tensions, which had led to years of war in the 1640s and the overthrow of Mary's grandfather, had not disappeared. They would soon arise again, and when they did, they would shape Mary's adult life. Mary's early life mirrored that of the average member of the royal family in early modern times. She was baptized in the Anglican faith as a Protestant and, unlike her parents, would continue to adhere to Protestantism ardently throughout her lifetime. This was largely because her uncle the king was adamant that whatever James and Anne did, their children should be raised as Anglicans. Mary was raised with her own household staff, a common method of child rearing for royals in the 17th century, at Richmond Palace near London. The governess of her household, with whom Mary would have had a closer relationship growing up than with her parents, was Lady Frances Villiers, the wife of Edward Villiers, a nephew of the Duke of Buckingham, who had been the most powerful political figure in England back in the days of James I and Charles I in the 1610s and 1620s. Edward was also a close ally of Clarendon's, and so Mary's care was entrusted to the wife of this prominent political figure of the Restoration era. At Richmond, growing up, she was afforded a classical education enriched with the Renaissance humanism which had become fashionable in the 16th century. This meant she learnt the Greek and Roman classics, how to dance and play music, as well as the ability to speak French, which was becoming regarded as the most culturally sophisticated language in Europe at the time. Mary was not James and Anne's only child, far from it, in fact. Prior to her being born, Mary's parents had already had a son who they named Charles after James's brother, but the child died of smallpox, the deadliest disease of early modern Europe, in May 1661, when he was just 7 months old. Further siblings followed, though. A boy named James after his father was born in the summer of 1663, when Mary was just over a year old. The closest thing that Mary had to a lifelong companion of sorts, although their paths would diverge for many years in their late teens and early adult lives, her sister Anne was born in February 1665. Then, a year and a half later, another boy called Charles yet again came into the world, followed by Edgar over a year later in September 1667, and then Henrietta in 1669. The last of the brood, a girl called Catherine, was born in February of 1671. Moreover, Mary had many half-siblings, James, Duke of York, being a serial philanderer, as was his brother, King Charles. For instance, James had 4 children with his long-term mistress, Arabella Churchill, all born between 1667 and 1674. Several of these were raised in and around the court and given noble titles in time. The fact that they were Mary's half-siblings was fairly widely known. As large as the family grew to be in the years after Mary's birth, it was also struck repeatedly by tragedy. While James's illegitimate children with Arabella Churchill generally lived fairly lengthy lives and all reached adulthood, the same was decidedly not the case when it came to his children with Anne. In the summer of 1667, when he was just shy of his 4th birthday, Mary's brother James died during the last major bout of bubonic plague to strike England in the early modern period. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that only weeks earlier, their little brother Charles, an infant of just 10 months, had died after a series of convulsions at St. James's Palace. 2 years later, Henrietta died in infancy as well, at 10 months of age in November 1669. The final and worst bout of tragedy followed in 1671. At the end of March that year, Mary's mother, Anne, died from what is widely understood to have been advanced breast cancer, which she had been suffering from for several years. Her condition had possibly resulted in her younger children being born with health conditions, and just 10 weeks after her own passing, her only remaining son, Mary's brother Edgar, died at 3 years of age. This tragic saga came to an end in December 1671 when Catherine, the youngest of the siblings, who Anne had only given birth to 7 weeks before her own death, passed away. Like 2 of her other siblings, she was almost exactly 10 months old at the time of her death. Even by the standards of the 17th century, when infant mortality was very high, this was a particularly cruel familial experience. It left just Mary and Anne alive out of the 8 children James and Anne had. They were close in childhood as a result, but, as we will see, their paths diverged when they were little more than teenagers. One of the more interesting interludes during Mary's youth, in the years after the family's many tragedies had climaxed in 1671, was her relationship with Francis Apsley. Frances was the daughter of Sir Alan Apsley, a noted soldier and military administrator who had served the Royalist cause loyally during the civil wars of the 1640s and had been rewarded accordingly in the 1660s, while also serving with distinction during the Second Anglo-Dutch War in the mid-1660s, where he had been at sea under the command of Mary's father. His daughter Frances, who was born in 1653 and was, consequently, nearly 10 years older than Mary, was appointed as a maid of honour in the households of Mary and Anne in the early 1670s. Mary was evidently a great admirer of Frances, and from 1675 onwards she began composing a series of what eventually became dozens of letters to Apsley, in which she adopted the guise of a loving wife to Francis, whom she addressed as her dearest, dearest, dear husband. Curiously, Anne also composed letters to Francis playing the role of a substitute spouse. Bizarrely, even after she was married and living abroad, Mary continued writing to Francis declaring, "I love you of all things in the world." The correspondence has understandably led to some historians speculating whether or not Mary was bisexual or a lesbian, but it is also possible that Mary and Anne, in writing these letters, were dealing in literary tropes, and the letters are also suffused with references to characters from plays performed on the London stage in the 17th century. Perhaps they were adopting the guises of characters from such plays, or perhaps Mary's statements hint at a more complex sexuality. We will most likely never know for sure, and historians remain divided on this. Whatever her sexual inclinations as a teenager might have been, given the mores of the 17th century and her position as the niece of the King of England, there was never any question that Mary would be married off to some high-ranking European noble. This was especially the case because King Charles was without any legitimate children by the mid-1670s, and Mary, as his eldest niece, was consequently a pawn in the diplomatic politics of Western Europe at the time. There were only really 2 contenders for whom Mary might marry, and which was chosen depended on whether or not England wanted to continue its rivalry with the Dutch Republic, which had resulted in 3 wars between the mid-1650s and the mid-1670s, or to ally with the Dutch and try to prevent France's efforts to expand into the Low Countries and Western Germany. As such, the debate was over whether Mary should marry the Grand Dauphin Louis, eldest son and heir of King Louis XIV of France, or William, Prince of Orange, the stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland, and the most powerful figure in the Dutch Republic. Louis was close in age to Mary, being less than a year older, while William was already into his mid-20s. But it was determined that the alliance with the Dutch was preferable, and in 1677 Mary was informed that she would marry William. On the 4th of November 1677, Mary was married to William at St. James's Palace in England by the Bishop of London, Henry Compton, a cleric who would feature in many key moments in her life. The 15-year-old girl cried through the ceremony which married her to William, who happened to celebrate his 27th birthday the same day as the wedding. That evening, King Charles, who had arranged the marriage, oversaw the bedding ceremony whereby family members and attendants led the newlyweds to their chamber to consummate the marriage. Royal unions, such as they were in early modern times, were often unpleasant affairs. The marriage would also face further hurdles. As we have seen, there were some signs that Mary was possibly bisexual or lesbian, yet this would have been known to almost nobody, if true at all. But it was commonly whispered in England and the Dutch Republic that William was gay, and for years he had kept a number of close male companions around him in a manner which had led people to assume that they were more than just friends. Nevertheless, despite all of these inauspicious factors at the beginning, Mary and William's marriage would become a relatively strong one in time, the pair bonding in particular over their ardent Protestantism. After a 2-week period in which poor weather delayed their departure for the Low Countries, William and Mary headed for the Dutch Republic in early December 1677, arriving to the political capital, The Hague, on the 14th, where they made a formal entryway for the Dutch people to greet the closest thing to a queen which the Republic would have for many years to come. Mary had come to live in one of Europe's great countries. While the Dutch Republic was small, like the Netherlands today, it punched above its weight economically and politically. It was in Amsterdam and in London that capitalism had emerged in the first half of the 17th century, with stock markets and corporations being formed, while the Dutch had also begun acquiring colonies overseas in North America, the Caribbean, Southern Africa, Ceylon or Sri Lanka, and in the East Indies. The Republic had benefited immensely from this newfound wealth and entered a golden age in terms of Dutch culture and art. But its riches had also brought envy, and at the time Mary arrived to the Low Countries, King Louis XIV of France was engaged in a series of wars to try to conquer the Republic. This would form the backdrop of much of the subsequent events in Mary's life. Things in Mary and William's marriage were mixed in the first years. On the one hand, William was regularly absent owing to the fighting in the final stages of the Franco-Dutch War, but the union had quickly resulted in her becoming pregnant, and the Dutch people rapidly took to the new wife of the Prince of Orange. But misfortune of a kind which was not foreign to Mary's family soon struck. In mid-1678, she visited the town of Breda, where William was basing himself to oversee the defences of the south of the Republic from French incursions, when she became ill and suffered a miscarriage. Her natal history over the next 2 or 3 years is a matter of some debate. She experienced at least 2 more bouts of serious illness in 1679 and 1680, and it is generally assumed that at least one of these was a further miscarriage. Complications from these pregnancies seem to have permanently affected her ability to have children, and despite her expressed desire throughout the 1680s to do so, she and William would never have children. While Mary was suffering through her natal woes in the Low Countries, her father, James, was experiencing his own specific kind of crisis. Although Mary had been raised largely as a Protestant, as had her sister Anne, with some considerable urging from their uncle the king to satiate public sentiment around religion, their father James was a confirmed Roman Catholic. He had been so for many years, but he had never publicly broadcast this on account of how potentially controversial the possible accession of a Roman Catholic king at some future time could be. But in 1673, the English Parliament had passed the Test Act, whereby all public figures and officials had to declare their religion. With this, James's Roman Catholicism became common knowledge, and with his brother Charles's marriage having failed to result in legitimate children and an heir, the possibility was now very real that James would one day succeed as a Roman Catholic monarch. In the late 1670s, this led Parliament to try to introduce a measure to exclude James from the succession altogether on account of his religion. The exclusion crisis, as it became known, was weathered by Charles and James, and Mary's father's position in the succession was confirmed by 1681, but the seeds of a potential future conflict when he became king, particularly so if he was too zealous in his Roman Catholicism, were clear for all to see. This would soon drag Mary back into the fold of English politics. James's religion would not have been a political problem had Charles simply produced an heir and secured the direct line of succession. And there certainly was no problem for Charles when it came to having children. The man whose reign became notorious for the hard-living court at his own penchant for parties and attending the theatre had well over a dozen children. Indeed, scholars are still divided as to how many children exactly he had, and in all likelihood, Charles wasn't sure himself. But there was a problem. All of them were sired with his mistresses, women like Barbara Palmer, Catherine Pegg, and the stage actresses Nell Gwynn and Mary Moll Davis. His marriage, though, to Queen Catherine remained childless after she suffered 3 miscarriages early on in their union. Moreover, despite suggestions that he should divorce her and remarry to produce a legitimate heir, Charles remained married to Catherine down to his death. Thus, when Charles died in February 1685, possibly from uremia, James succeeded his brother as King James II of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was the dreaded scenario that the more rabidly anti-Catholic elements within English political circles had feared for many years. Furthermore, to compound matters, James made it clear within months of his accession that he intended to favour his fellow Catholics when it came to government and to begin attacking the privileges of Protestants across Britain and Ireland. The stage was set for a showdown. An indication of the fact that Mary might be a possible tool for the Protestant lords and gentry of England to help remove her Roman Catholic father was provided before James had ascended to the throne. For several years, James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, one of King Charles II's illegitimate children, had been living in the Low Countries. A Protestant and Charles's eldest illegitimate child, he had become increasingly popular in England from the late 1670s as James's public persona plummeted. Many viewed him as a potential king, despite his illegitimacy, having been born to Lucy Walter, a Welsh noblewoman who was Charles's mistress on the continent in the late 1640s. In the final years of Charles's reign, Monmouth became an increasingly prominent figure at The Hague, where Mary and William lionized him as Charles's son. This was a dangerous development, as calls were growing amongst some elements in England for Monmouth to try and claim the throne when Charles died, which is exactly what he did. In the summer of 1685, Monmouth landed in southwest England and launched a rebellion with the intention of overthrowing James and claiming the throne himself. It was a badly organised affair and engendered little popular support, the result being that within a few weeks it was suppressed and Monmouth was detained and executed for treason on the 15th of July 1685. Mary and William distanced themselves from Monmouth's actions, but the very fact that they had allowed him such a prominent place at The Hague in the years leading up to his rebellion points towards an ambiguous stance towards James's kingship. Many figures in England must have noticed this too. Consequently, when events took a major turn in Britain in 1688, they began to consider reaching out to Mary and William as alternative rulers to Mary's father. The first development was James's aggressive move to favour Roman Catholicism in England and Ireland. The second was the birth of a male heir, James Francis Edward, through James's marriage to Mary of Modena, a child who now displaced Mary in the line of succession and who would almost certainly be raised as a Catholic, unlike his half-sister. With this, 7 prominent English political figures, Henry Sidney, Edward Russell, the Earl of Shrewsbury Charles Talbot, the Earl of Devonshire William Cavendish, the Earl of Danby Thomas Osborne, Richard Viscount Lumley, and the Bishop of London Henry Compton, known to posterity as the Immortal Seven, sent a famous invitation to William. In this letter, which William and Mary received on the 30th of June 1688, they asked William to intervene in Britain with military force to depose James and seize the crown for himself and Mary. It briefly laid out the well-known grievances against James, principally his religion, but also declaring that the new heir, just born to Mary of Modena, was illegitimate and was not the child of James and Mary, a conspiracy theory of sorts which was immediately doing the rounds in Britain following the birth. Therefore, the 7 signatories stated William needed to intervene to impose his wife's rightful claim to the throne. It has been a long-standing matter of debate as to what Mary's emotional response to the invitation was. After all, the set of events which were now being put in motion would end with the armies of her husband invading Britain and deposing her own father. Clearly, he would be offered the opportunity to go into exile or live out his days in some other peaceable manner if he proved compliant, but there was always the possibility that he would resist in such a fashion that James would, like his own father back in 1649, end up dead at the end of the political turmoil. She was clearly conflicted and upset at the idea of overthrowing her father, but it came down to a battle in her conscience between her paternal loyalty and her ardent Protestantism and sense of duty to the state. Ultimately, the latter won out, though James's statements to Mary, such as that found in a letter of 1688 that "You will be still as good a daughter to a father that has always loved you so tenderly," must have made her decision more difficult. Yet, in assessing her decision to betray her father, it must also be considered that as a member of the royal family, she had been raised in her own household largely away from her parents, and she had married at 15 years of age and left England for the Dutch Republic. Ultimately, her loyalties by 1688 lay primarily with her husband, and William was eager to accept the invitation which was extended to him and Mary, and to claim the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. What followed is known in British political history as the Glorious Revolution. With Mary's agreement to depose her father and take the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland based on her claims to them, William gathered a significant army and fleet and prepared to invade Britain. This was speedily accomplished, as the Dutch Republic was heavily militarized at the time in preparation for war with France. Hence, he was able to land in the English West Country with a force of 20,000 men in early November 1688. In the weeks that followed, he began advancing towards London. As he did, James's authority as king crumbled, and the royal army and navy, so much of which were comprised of Protestants and led by Protestant commanders, made it clear they would not fight to preserve his position. 2 days before Christmas Day, he fled England for France, after William deliberately allowed him enough time to leave the country unimpeded. Mary, who had remained in the Low Countries while William led the invasion, now crossed to England, where she and William triumphantly entered London in a heavily stage-managed event. Unlike in the 1640s, when Parliament had become so opposed to Mary's grandfather, King Charles I, in large part owing to the perception of him being a crypto-Catholic, that it led to a long and bloody civil war, the Glorious Revolution, at least initially, was an almost bloodless coup, with James quickly deposed and Mary and William's cause left triumphant. There remained the matter of exactly what political arrangement would now be imposed. James's deposition in favour of Mary and William was based entirely on Mary's position as his eldest daughter and the next in line to the throne, if one accepted the dubious argument that James's recently born son was illegitimate. Consequently, in order for the events of 1688 to not seem like an outright usurpation of the throne, it was necessary that Mary would rule as Queen Regnant. But she was a woman who believed firmly in the social conventions of her time that dictated that a woman should be largely subservient to her husband, and so she was unwilling to consign William to the position of a king consort. That is, a king who did not exercise royal authority himself, but was merely the husband of the reigning queen. As a result, a highly unusual political arrangement was put in place in the course of the first months of 1689. Mary and William would rule as joint monarchs. This would legitimize the Glorious Revolution in that Mary would be queen, but it would allow William to play the senior role as king. There was a precedent for this when Mary's namesake, Queen Mary I of the House of Tudor, had married Prince Philip of Spain, the future King Philip II, in 1554. She had also been a tradition-bound monarch who perceived that she should not occupy a status above her husband, and so Mary and Philip had ruled as dual monarchs for 4 years in the mid-1550s until Mary's premature death. But unlike in that situation, the understanding was that even if William outlived Mary, he would continue to rule, whereas back in 1558, when Mary Tudor died, Philip was removed as king in favour of Mary's sister, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. Mary and William's coronation was quickly organised in a much faster fashion than was typical, as Parliament and the new monarchs sought to hold the event as soon as possible as a demonstration to the people of the changes which had occurred, and to present to the public the new Dutch king and the queen, a young woman who had left England a decade earlier as a teenager and was now returning to rule over Britain and Ireland. The coronation took place on the 11th of April 1689. It was unique in English political history for being the dual coronation of a king and queen regnant. All other coronations before and since have featured either a king regnant or queen regnant, usually with a queen consort or king consort, but never a king regnant and queen regnant together. William used the traditional coronation chair, while a special coronation chair to accommodate the dual nature of the ceremony was constructed for Mary. This closely resembled the traditional coronation chair, but would only be used once ever, on that spring day in 1689, by Mary. It sits in Westminster Abbey still today. A separate coronation orb was also produced by Robert Viner for Mary, while a coronation crown was produced for her from the crown worn by her stepmother, Mary of Modena, at the coronation of her father 4 years earlier. The ceremony was also unusual in that it was the Bishop of London, Henry Compton, who had been one of the Immortal Seven who signed the invitation to William in 1688 and had married the couple back in 1677, who presided over the ceremony, as the sitting Archbishop of Canterbury, William Sancroft, refused to perform the coronation or accept the legitimacy of the new monarchs. Thus, Mary and William were crowned by the Bishop of London rather than the Archbishop of Canterbury, as has been customary in England for centuries. The Glorious Revolution and the accession of Mary and William were highly significant from a constitutional perspective in Britain. For centuries, there had been a conflict between the Crown and the wider political community in England to limit the power of the monarchy. As early as the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, of 1215, the English nobility had extracted concessions from King John, whereby he had to concede that he could not impose changes on them unilaterally, and that they had certain rights under the Crown. In the 17th century, the conflict had switched to the rights of Parliament and the wider population with respect to the Crown, and this lay behind the civil wars of the 1640s. It was also central to the Glorious Revolution. As part of the political arrangements whereby Mary and William ascended to the throne in 1688, a Declaration of Right had been presented to the new monarchs by Parliament. In this, the rights of Parliament and the body politic in England, as well as the limitations on the power of the Crown, were clearly laid out. For instance, it was stated that it was illegal for the Crown to impose taxes without parliamentary consent, or to maintain a standing army without Parliament's approval. These wide-ranging limitations on the power of the Crown were further enshrined through the passage of the Bill of Rights in 1689, a parliamentary act which was a major turning point in the development of a constitutional monarchy in Britain. As such, Mary and her husband have an important position in the constitutional history of the United Kingdom. The Glorious Revolution, the expulsion of James from England, and the coronation of Mary and William as joint rulers of England, Scotland, and Ireland in his place was never going to be accepted peacefully. James had many supporters. For instance, in Scotland, many of the most powerful lords and political figures, while they might have been opposed to James's religious stance, were bound to tradition and found the idea of deposing a rightful king of the Scottish House of Stuart in order to replace him with a Dutchman to be unacceptable. Eventually, a separate political agreement would have to be reached between the Scots and the new monarchs. Support for James was even greater in Ireland, where the majority of the Old English and Irish lords were Roman Catholics. They had been oppressed by a Protestant minority for decades, but in the brief time James had been king, they had been given major powers and were assured that they would regain much of the lands they had lost over the past century and a half. They immediately signalled in 1688 and 1689 that they would fight to uphold James's position as king. And to compound matters, after he fled to the continent, James quickly found a powerful ally in the shape of King Louis XIV of France, who had been at war intermittently with the Dutch throughout his reign, and now viewed the events in Britain as a good opportunity to do so again. As a result, in 1688, the 9 Years' War, or War of the League of Augsburg, broke out with France going to war with Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Austrian Habsburgs. James's efforts to reclaim his throne were but one element of this pan-European war. While there were many fronts in the 9 Years' War, the fighting which concerned the royal struggle in Britain primarily played out in Ireland in a conflict which raged there between 1689 and 1691, and which is typically known as the Williamite War after Mary's husband, or the War of the Two Kings. With French support and soldiers, James headed to Ireland in 1689 and intended to use it as his base of operations to eventually lead an army to Britain and reclaim his thrones. He garnered the support of huge numbers of Roman Catholic lords there, and by the summer of 1689 had control over most of the country, excluding the Protestant north, where his allies failed to seize the city of Derry in a long siege that year. Then, while Mary ruled in England in his absence, William led an army to Ireland, landing in the northeast and then heading south towards Dublin in the spring of 1690. William and James's forces clashed at the Battle of the Boyne on the 1st of July 1690. Although the engagement was not decisive, it had the appearance of a Williamite victory, and in its aftermath, with additional English, Dutch and German soldiers arriving to reinforce William in Ireland, James fled back to France. Although the war would continue in Ireland for over another year before the Williamite forces emerged victorious, after the decisive Battle of Aughrim, his cause was effectively defeated when he left Ireland. Although the wider 9 Years' War with the French would drag on until 1697, James never posed a threat to Mary and William after 1691, and he would live out the rest of his life in exile in France. With William absent in Ireland and other theatres of the war within just a few months of their accession and coronation in England, Mary was the monarch on the ground in London and at Westminster, charged with running domestic affairs, while her husband handled Britain's foreign policy. She left the day-to-day management of government affairs to the Privy Council, the early modern equivalent of a government cabinet, and senior political figures, several of them being the Immortal Seven who had invited William and her to England in 1688, but she was cognizant of both her need to be the public face of the new regime and to manage the intricate politics of the court at a time when many felt conflicted about the manner in which James had been overthrown. There were also many clashes of personality. Mary's sister Anne, for instance, grew to detest William, urged on by hangers-on like Sarah Churchill, the wife of the Earl of Marlborough. Mary had no option but to act as peacemaker in this and a wide range of other relationships. Meanwhile, much of her active interventions in domestic policy in the early 1690s concerned reforms to taxation, the customs system, and how Crown and government revenue were being spent. The 9 Years' War was proving extremely costly, and the state finances needed to be carefully managed to pay for all of it, while at the same time not alienating Parliament and Mary and William's new subjects so early in the reign through excessive taxation and subsidies. The burden of government did not sit well with Mary. By nature, she preferred other pursuits. One of her major passions was gardening. During her years in the Low Countries, she had been central to the development of the gardens at Utlo, a palace of the House of Orange-Nassau in Apeldoorn in Gelderland in the Netherlands, where she had collaborated with Claude de Goetz, a French architect and landscape designer who had studied under André Le Nôtre, the chief garden architect at Louis XIV's Grand Palace of Versailles outside Paris in France. Versailles had become the paragon of Baroque architectural splendour in the second half of the 17th century, and it was little surprise that when Mary commissioned a redevelopment of Hampton Court Palace near London, many elements of the redesign mirrored the French royal estate. Animals featured in all these residences, and Mary continued in the tradition of having many dogs around the royal palaces which had been established by her great-grandfather and grandfather in the first half of the century. Her favourite breed were pugs, but her love of animals was not confined exclusively to dogs, and her years as queen saw ponds of tropical fish and goldfish appearing in the royal palaces around London. Her pastimes also, somewhat unusually, included ice skating, a hobby which had been introduced to England during the Restoration period after Mary's uncle and father and other members of the Stuart court in exile had encountered it in the Low Countries in the 1650s. For a woman who would only live to be 32 years of age, Mary is associated with an incredible 97 portraits. Clearly, she did not sit for all of these, or else, given that people often sat for several days to have their portrait painted in early modern times, Mary would have spent a substantial amount of her adult life having her picture painted, and many of the portraits of her were copied from others. But she was, nevertheless, an unusually extensively painted young monarch. One of the earliest was produced by Peter Lely, a Dutch painter who had the unusual distinction of having flourished under the successive patronage of King Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, and King Charles II between the 1640s and the 1670s. Around 1672, he painted young Mary in the guise of Diana, the Greek goddess of hunting, with Mary wielding a bow and arrow. Lely was also behind one of the most famous portraits of Mary, one which probably dates to 1677 on the occasion of her marriage to William, and in which she wears an orange dress to symbolize her entry into the House of Orange. This portrait became the basis for many subsequent copies, but arguably the most recognizable of all the portraits of her was that produced by Jan Verkolje, a Dutchman who painted portraits of both Mary and William around 1690 to celebrate their accession, with Mary seated next to a table bearing her coronation crown. One of Mary's most enduring accomplishments was the development of Kensington Palace. This evolved from a modest two-storey house which had been built in the village of Kensington near London back in the reign of James I, Mary's great-grandfather, by Sir George Coppin. By the late 1680s, the Jacobean house was known as Nottingham House, as it was owned by the Secretary of State, Daniel Finch, 2nd Earl of Nottingham. It was from Finch that Mary and William purchased the house in 1689 to serve as a retreat near London, but away from the damp air off the River Thames and the coal smoke of the city, both of which were undesirable for the asthma that William suffered from. Mary then hired the greatest architect of the age, Sir Christopher Wren, who had rebuilt much of London following the Great Fire of 1666, to expand Nottingham House into a palace worthy of monarchy. Wren added 3-storey pavilions on each end of the house, with separate apartments for Mary and William and servants' quarters. Extensive gardens were also laid out around the grounds, while, after the King and Queen moved in late 1689, Mary commissioned the construction of what is now the Queen's Gallery at Kensington. A fire in 1691 in many ways made the house grander, as elements of the more modest Jacobean house were gutted and replaced with marble staircases and new galleries and chambers. Nicholas Hawksmoor, who would later contribute much to the construction of Blenheim Palace, one of England's greatest country houses, was involved early in his career in the construction of the King's Gallery at Kensington in the early 1690s. Much of what a visitor to Kensington sees today was added subsequently by Queen Anne or the Hanoverian monarchs, but the initial development and vision for Kensington Palace can be credited to Mary and William. As well as patronising architects such as Wren and Hawksmoor, Mary and William were also major sponsors of several prominent musicians in England following their accession. For instance, Henry Purcell, who would subsequently compose the music for Mary's funeral, was patronised by the new monarchs. Purcell is generally considered one of England's foremost opera composers, and in eschewing Italian, French and Austrian musical patterns in favour of a uniquely English sound, he was groundbreaking for his time. But there was a reason why Mary sponsored figures like Purcell. He was a paragon of English Protestant court music, and so was favoured. whereas the more fashionable Baroque music, inspired by the music of the French and Austrian courts, was contrastingly reviled under Mary and William as symptomatic of the Catholic Church. Thus, unadorned religious music of the Protestant variety was favoured in London in the 1690s, and even Purcell's compositions incorporated more austere passages from the Book of Psalms, while drums and strings were more in vogue than the piano and violin. Nevertheless, the court music Mary sponsored sits firmly in the shadow of what came later as George Frederick Handel, one of the three great figures of Baroque music, along with Antonio Vivaldi and Johann Sebastian Bach, became the court composer of King George I and King George II in England in the first half of the 18th century. One of Mary's foremost concerns was with moral conduct and austere piety in line with her ardent Protestantism. She was anxious to combat public vice of all kinds, particularly overly liberal approaches to sex, drunkenness, and the depiction of immoral conduct on the London stage, all social developments which had flourished during her uncle's lengthy reign and which her father, for all his alleged religious piety, was no stranger to himself. In this capacity, Mary decided to patronize the foundation of the Society for the Reformation of Manners in 1691, a group founded in London with the goal of tackling what its members perceived as social vices, including profanity, prostitution, excessive drinking, and licentiousness. It sought to foster a more puritanical religious environment and also to crack down on brothels, inns, and taverns where excessive drinking occurred and to censor the city's playwrights. In line with their goals, Mary issued a proclamation against vices of various kinds in the early 1690s. Mary was also known to patronize the publication of religious sermons given at the court, where she believed they could influence people into sombre and sober living. Some of this was effective. London became a more restrained city in the final years of the 17th century and into the 18th than it had been during the reign of Charles II. As reluctant as she might have been to rule in her own right, and as much as she viewed her position as subservient to that of her husband as king, Mary was more than capable of being firm when she needed to be. She displayed this amply when it came to her extended family and friends. Her uncle, Henry Hyde, 2nd Earl of Clarendon, the brother of Mary's deceased mother Anne, despite disagreeing with King James on many matters during his brief reign, never accepted the legitimacy of Mary and William's usurpation of the throne, and he had refused to take the oaths of loyalty to the new monarchs that were sworn in 1689 and 1690. The government was unwilling to prosecute the Queen's uncle in any fashion while his opposition was limited, but in the course of 1690 it became apparent that he was communicating with Richard Graham, 1st Viscount Preston, a prominent supporter of James's cause, who was in close contact with the deposed king and his supporters in France. Mary acted firmly and ordered the arrest of her uncle as the details emerged. He was eventually released, but only on the condition that he retire to his country estate and not conspire any further, his political career coming to an end in the process. Mary took a similarly firm stance when it was revealed in the course of late 1691 and early 1692 that John Churchill, Earl of Marlborough and the future Duke of Marlborough, and hero of the War of the Spanish Succession, was in contact with the Jacobites on the continent, ordering her sister Anne to dismiss her close friend, Sarah Churchill, John's wife, from her entourage. Marlborough himself was eventually committed to the Tower of London for several weeks, and his political rehabilitation would only begin after Mary's death. An indication of Mary's attitude towards church and state affairs can be seen from the fact that when she missed church services in the late spring of 1692, due to suffering from a fever, it was the first time she had been absent from Mass on Sunday in 12 years. As committed Protestants, she and William moved to make the Church of England more staunchly Protestant in its outlook, in contrast to the religious climate of much of the 17th century, where Anglicanism had been a conservative religious force, one which stood midway between the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches of the Dutch Republic, the Swiss cantons, and many German states. Central to this was the passage of the Act of Toleration in May 1689, whereby radical Protestant groups such as the Baptists, Puritans, Quakers, and Congregationalists were granted full religious toleration. This was a significant moment in English church history and shaped the religious environment down to the 19th century. Mary also oversaw the first steps in the reform of the English liturgy and the manner in which religious services were held, appointing Compton, who had facilitated the Glorious Revolution and presided over Mary and William's coronation, to head a commission of ecclesiastical and lay figures that reformed the liturgy in the 1690s. Overall, her brief reign saw a shift towards greater Protestantism within the Church of England. One of the most enduring legacies of the brief period that Mary and William were co-rulers of the three kingdoms was achieved far across the Atlantic Ocean in the British colonies of North America. Although they had developed greatly since the first colonies were established here in the early 17th century, there was still only one institute of higher learning in the British colonies, Harvard University in New England. There had been plans back in the late 1610s and 1620s to establish a college in the southern colonies in Virginia, but this had been abandoned at the time. Now, in 1691, Dr. James Blair, a Scottish-born missionary and educator who had settled in Virginia in the mid-1680s, arrived to England to petition the government to establish a college in Virginia. Mary proved receptive to his proposal, which was supported by the bishops of London and Canterbury, and so, on the 8th of February 1693, a royal charter was issued for the establishment of what was to be known as the College of William and Mary. Blair became its first president, and funds were allocated to it through the government excise on tobacco produced in Virginia. It was established in what became the town of Williamsburg and remains the second oldest university in the United States today. Unfortunately, the establishment of the College of William and Mary, the Queen's patronage of the Society for the Reformation of Manners, and her development of Kensington Palace would broadly constitute the core of her accomplishments as Queen in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, for Mary's reign and life were to be cut strikingly short in the mid-1690s. Mary was a healthy woman, and beyond her natal woes there was little to suggest in the first years of her reign that she would live anything other than a long life and reign for some time to come. But at some stage in November 1694, she contracted smallpox. This was the deadliest disease of the early modern world. While the plague came and went in waves, smallpox was a perennial presence across Europe, killing hundreds of thousands every year and leaving millions more who had survived badly scarred. Given the typical pathology and incubation period, Mary must have contracted it in November as her symptoms appeared early in December. This resulted in a rash and pus-filled sores in the early period. Smallpox killed approximately 15% of those who contracted it, and Mary was one of the unlucky ones. Her condition worsened in the second half of December, and on the 28th of the month, she died at Kensington. It was a brutal and lonely death. Her sole surviving sibling, Anne, who was pregnant, had not had smallpox and had no immunity, and Mary ordered that she was not to be allowed to visit her. Mary was just 32 years of age when she passed away. The winter that Mary died was a particularly cold one in England at the tail end of the Little Ice Age of the early modern world, a centuries-long era during which temperatures were significantly lower than in modern times. One feature of this was that the River Thames regularly froze. This occurred in the winter of 1694 and, with transport around London limited as a result, the decision was taken that Mary's funeral would not be held until well into the spring. William was distraught at the death of his wife, with whom he might not have had a conventional romantic relationship, but one of considerable mutual respect. Her funeral was held on the 5th of March 1695, after her body had lain in state at the Banqueting Hall of Westminster for several weeks. The ceremony was unprecedented in English political history in being attended by members of both the House of Commons and Lords, but William was not there, apparently so psychologically fazed by Mary's death that he could not bring himself to attend. It was an enormously elaborate state funeral, one which cost £50,000, a fortune for a funeral in late 17th century terms. At the end, Mary's body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey in the south aisle of the chapel of King Henry VII. It was intended that a large monument would be raised to celebrate the site in the years that followed, but a small stone alone marks the spot today, the monument having been abandoned owing to a lack of space in the relatively small aisle. William would be interred alongside her many years later, and in 1725, life-size wax effigies of the pair who claimed the throne as part of the Glorious Revolution were placed in Westminster Abbey. Following Mary's death, William continued to rule as King of England, Scotland and Ireland, though he was often derided in private by many of his British subjects as a Dutch upstart, one whose influence would be expunged from the country when he died. After all, he and Mary had never had any children, and even if William were to remarry and produce an heir in that way, the line of succession which had been agreed would place any such children lower down the succession order. Instead, Mary's surviving sister, Anne, was to succeed when William died, and then her children when they would presumably be born. But Anne's natal history was even bleaker than her sister's. Despite 17 pregnancies, she nearly always suffered miscarriages or had her children die in infancy. The only child to survive past infancy, a boy named William, died of unclear causes in August 1700 when he was 11 years of age. Thus, when William III died in March 1702 and Anne succeeded him at 37 years of age, it looked very much like the Stuart line would die out with her. And so it proved. She reigned for 12 years, but when Mary's sister died in 1714 following a stroke, the crown passed to George, Elector of Hanover in Germany, a cousin of the Stuarts through his being a great-grandson of King James I. With this, the House of Stuart was replaced by the House of Hanover, which would rule into the 19th century, though James II's son and grandson and their supporters would attempt 2 uprisings in Scotland to restore the Jacobite line of the House of Stuart in 1715 and 1745. Both failed. Mary II was a contradictory Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland in many senses. On the one hand, she was absolutely central to one of the most momentous events in British political history. Her position as James II's eldest surviving child and as a committed Protestant, as well as her marriage to William of Orange, paved the way for the Glorious Revolution when her father made clear his intentions to begin aggressively favouring the Roman Catholic Church after he became king in 1685. In this sense, her reign was absolutely critical to the constitutional development of the United Kingdom and its religious landscape. Had James remained as king into the early 18th century and then been succeeded by his Roman Catholic son, Britain and Ireland would have moved substantially back towards Roman Catholicism. The deposition of James and accession of William and Mary ensured that this did not occur. But, as significant as her role was in this respect, she was otherwise a relatively inconsequential queen. First, she was happy to rule in the shadow of her husband, and even when he was absent on military campaign, she often deferred to others. Secondly, her life was cut very short in 1694, not long after she became queen. As a result, while her role in the Glorious Revolution has assured for her a significant place in British history, her life was a short one, and one dominated by family tragedies and conflict. What do you think of Queen Mary II? Was her acceptance of the British crown an act of ruthless treason against her father, or, as a Protestant, was she wise to assist her husband, William of Orange, to seize the crown from a Catholic, thus paving the way for the British monarchy to become truly constitutional through the Glorious Revolution? Please, let us know in the comment section. And, in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.